Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to be talking about something a lot of you might find helpful, and that's how bankruptcy can play a role in divorce, especially when you're talking about situations where debt is a major factor.
Absolutely.
We're going to be looking at this awesome book called The Complete Book on Bankruptcy,
Yes.
written by Peter Francis Juracy of Juracy Law.
Mm-hmm.
This book is chock full of
Yeah.
practical, real-world examples.
Right.
So hopefully this is going to give us a little bit of insight into how this whole process can work.
Absolutely.
And hopefully maybe even make divorce a little bit easier.
Right.
Now, of course, before we get into this, we do need to remind you
Yes.
that this is just a conversation.
Of course.
We're not giving legal advice, and this is not something that you should be substituting for talking to a qualified attorney
Yes.
about your own specific circumstances.
That's right. Just listening to us doesn't make you a client of Juracy Law. And just because they've gotten certain results in the past doesn't mean you're going to get those same results.
Right.
Every case is different, every divorce is different, and every financial situation is different as well.
Absolutely. And speaking of different cases, one thing that I found really interesting in this book was that filing for bankruptcy doesn't just wipe out all debts related to a divorce.
That's right.
I think a lot of people think it's just kind of a clean slate,
Yeah, they think it's like a magic wand.
It's
Everything's gone.
You just do it. And all
Yeah.
of a sudden everything's fine. But that's actually not the case.
That's not always the case. That's right. There are certain debts that are tied to a divorce that are considered what we call non-dischargeable, which means you're still responsible for them even if you file for bankruptcy.
So what kind of debts are we talking about when we say non-dischargeable?
Well, we're talking about things like child support, alimony, things like that. The courts see those as being essential obligations, and they're very protective of them.
Yeah, you can't just use bankruptcy to get out of,
Exactly.
supporting your kids or supporting a former spouse who's financially dependent on you.
Absolutely. The well-being of the children and the former spouse is a top priority for the courts in these cases.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. But here's where I think things get really interesting, and I bet a lot of people don't realize this bankruptcy can be a really helpful tool during a divorce
Yeah.
if you get the timing right.
You're absolutely right. If you file a joint Chapter 7 bankruptcy before the divorce is finalized, you can actually wipe out a lot of the shared debt, and that can make the whole process much smoother.
Okay, so imagine this. You and your soon-to-be ex are struggling with, tons of credit card debt, personal loans, maybe some medical bills,
Right.
all that shared debt that can make divorce so much more stressful.
Right.
And what Juracy Law is suggesting here is that you could file for Chapter 7 together, get rid of all that shared debt, and then move forward with the divorce.
Exactly. That's the idea. And it really can simplify things tremendously. And it can even reduce some of the conflict and the resentment that comes up when you're trying to figure out who pays what.
Yeah, it's like hitting a reset button.
Absolutely.
And it just seems like it can help couples move forward in a more amicable way, especially when there's just no money to pay those debts off.
Right. And, it really highlights why timing is so crucial in this, because filing for bankruptcy after the divorce can create more headaches.
Oh, yeah.
Because let's say one spouse files and the other doesn't.
Right.
Well, now those creditors are going to come after the spouse who didn't file.
So it could really backfire.
Absolutely. And that's why getting legal advice early on is so important. You need to think strategically about how to best approach these situations.
Yeah, you really do. So speaking of legal advice, what about situations where one spouse actually owes money to the other as part of the divorce settlement?
Yes, that's where things get a little more complex. Sometimes divorce agreements involve one spouse agreeing to take on certain debts. What Juracy Law points out is that whether those debts can be discharged in bankruptcy depends on whether they're classified as support.
Okay, so this is where this support designation becomes really important. Can you give me an example of what that might look like in a real-life situation?
Sure. Let's say, as part of the divorce settlement, one spouse agrees to pay off a joint credit card. However, if the other spouse is working and isn't receiving alimony, the spouse paying off the card might be able to argue that it's not technically a support obligation.
And if it's not support, could it be discharged in bankruptcy?
Potentially, yes. But remember, the courts will look very closely at the divorce agreement and try to figure out what the original intent was behind that debt responsibility. They want to make sure it's not just a way to dodge a legitimate financial obligation.
Got it. So it sounds like a Chapter 13 bankruptcy might be more flexible than a Chapter 7 when it comes to handling these kinds of property settlement debts.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Chapter 13 allows you to restructure your debts and repay them over a period of 3 to 5 years.
Okay.
And this can be a useful strategy when you're dealing with debts that are related to property settlements or divorce agreements.
So to make this a little more concrete, juracy law gives this really helpful example in the book about a couple named Joe and Lisa
Yeah.
who are going through a divorce and they're really struggling
Yes.
with how to divide up all their debts.
Yes, Joe and Lisa are a perfect example of how messy things can get. They've got joint credit card debt, they've got a car loan in Joe's name that Lisa also uses, and a mortgage that they're both responsible for.
Oh, man.
Each of them wants the other to take on more of the burden,
Oh, yeah.
and it's causing a lot of tension.
Right. It's a classic scenario. Unfortunately, so many couples end up
It's very
in
common.
this kind of stalemate.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
But what juracy law does
Right.
is he lays out some potential solutions
Right.
using either Chapter 7 or Chapter 13
Mm-hmm.
that could help them work through this
Right.
financial split in a more amicable way.
Absolutely.
So let's walk through those options. What are some of the possibilities that he suggests for Joe and Lisa?
Well, the first option would be for them to file a joint Chapter 7 before they finalize their divorce.
Okay.
And that would completely wipe out their credit card debt.
Okay.
Which is great because that would instantly remove a major point of contention between them.
Right.
And then Joe could decide if he wants to keep making payments on that car loan or not.
Mm-hmm.
And Lisa would then have more flexibility to either refinance the house
Okay.
or sell it
Gotcha.
without that extra debt hanging over her head.
So that sounds pretty straightforward. What's the other option that he suggests?
The other option is if Lisa really wants to keep the house,
Mhm.
but she's behind on the mortgage payments, she could consider filing for Chapter 13 individually.
Individually. Okay.
And this would allow her to catch up on those missed payments over time,
Okay.
while also potentially getting some relief from other debts.
So it seems like there are different paths they could take depending on what their priorities are
Absolutely.
and what their goals are.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's all about tailoring the strategy
Right.
to your specific circumstances.
And it really highlights that this is where having both a bankruptcy attorney and a divorce lawyer on your side is absolutely crucial.
Couldn't agree more.
I think this is a great place to pause and shift gears a bit. I'm curious to hear what you, our listeners, are thinking right now.
Yes, this is a good time to pause for a moment and consider what we've talked about so far.
If you were in Joe and Lisa's shoes, facing a divorce and a lot of debt, what would your first step be?
What questions would be going through your mind right now? What would you want to learn more about?
Yeah, it's so important to think through those questions,
Mm-hmm.
really get clear on what information you need.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of the first step toward finding the right guidance.
That's right. And, as we've been learning from Peter Francis Juracy and Juracy Law,
Right.
seeking that legal advice early on can really make a huge difference
Yeah.
in how smoothly this whole process goes.
One thing that I found interesting is that a lot of people assume that they have to wait until the divorce is final
Yeah,
before they can file for bankruptcy.
that's a common misconception.
It is.
But as we've discussed, filing jointly before the divorce can actually be a lot more beneficial in many cases.
Yeah, and it's almost like, why drag it out? If you're
Yeah.
already struggling to pay off these debts, why make it a
Exactly.
battle in the divorce,
It just adds more stress and conflict to an already difficult situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But let's say someone's already divorced
Right,
and they're stuck with all this debt that they just can't handle.
right.
Is bankruptcy still a possibility for them?
It could be. It really just depends on what their divorce decree says and what those debts are.
Okay, so let's imagine that someone's divorce decree says that they're responsible for certain debts,
Okay,
but they're facing some real financial hardship.
okay.
What can they do?
Well, if their ex-spouse is working and the debt wasn't specifically assigned as like a form of support,
Right.
filing for Chapter 13 bankruptcy might actually allow them to discharge those debts.
So even if the divorce decree says that they're legally obligated to pay,
Right.
Chapter 13 could potentially?
It could potentially offer a way out, but
Okay.
it all comes back to this idea of support.
Yeah.
If the ex-spouse can argue successfully that those debts were meant to be financial support,
Right.
then they're less likely to be discharged.
So this support designation is so important.
It really is. It's one of the most important factors in figuring out if a debt can be wiped out in bankruptcy, especially when we're talking about the worst cases.
Now, what about situations where there's a court order that requires someone to pay certain bills?
Okay.
Could filing for bankruptcy eliminate that obligation as well?
It's possible, but it really depends on what that court order says.
Okay.
That's why juracy law really stresses that people need to bring all their paperwork relating to debt, including their divorce judgment, to a bankruptcy attorney.
So they can really look at everything.
Exactly. So they can analyze it all and figure out what all the options are. A good bankruptcy attorney is going to look at the big picture and take into account the complexities of the bankruptcy law,
Right.
but also the unique fact of that divorce case.
As juracy law says, these cases can be so complex
Yeah,
that getting professional guidance
it's essential.
is really essential. All right, so let's try to sum up some of the key takeaways from juracy law to our listeners.
Right.
First and foremost, if you're thinking about divorce and you're facing a mountain of debt, you might want to consider bankruptcy as a first step.
Absolutely. It can really help to avoid that whole battle over who owes what and give both parties a clean slate financially as they move forward.
Right. But it's important to remember that not all debts related to a divorce can be discharged through bankruptcy.
That's right.
Things like alimony, child support,
Right.
obligations that are considered support.
Exactly. Those are seen as essential obligations that can't just be erased through bankruptcy.
Exactly. And filing before the divorce is final
Right.
is often a lot smoother than doing it afterward.
That's right.
It just simplifies things, and it can help to prevent those situations where one spouse gets stuck with debts
Yeah.
that were discharged in the other spouse's bankruptcy.
Absolutely. Timing is a crucial factor to consider.
Exactly. And I think one of the most important points that juracy law makes is to always consult with both a bankruptcy attorney and a divorce lawyer
Yes.
in these situations.
I agree 100%. Having both of those perspectives can really make all the difference.
It's like having a whole team on your side,
Exactly.
helping you fight for your financial well-being.
That's right.
So as we wrap up this look at bankruptcy and divorce, I want to leave you with this final thought.
Okay.
If you were in a similar situation, what would you do next?
Would you reach out to Juracy Law for a free consultation, maybe gather up all your financial records, or would you sit down with your spouse or your ex-spouse and talk about the possibility of exploring bankruptcy?
These are all really important questions to think about. And remember, if you're facing a similar situation, getting that personalized legal advice is the best way to make sure you're making the right decisions for your financial future.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground today, but every situation is different. Getting guidance from those experienced professionals can help you navigate these complex situations with confidence.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation about bankruptcy and divorce. We hope you found it helpful.
And remember, even though we've gone over a lot of information today, the most important thing is to really understand your own situation and seek out that advice from those qualified professionals. Taking those steps can empower you to make the best choices for your financial well-being.
That's such an important message. Thanks for joining us for this episode, and we'll see you next time. It's so empowering
Yeah.
to realize that you have options,
Yeah,
even when things feel really tough.
absolutely.
And that's what I appreciate about this book by Peter Francis Juracy.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't just throw legal jargon at you. He really gives you
Right.
these real-world examples and
Excellent.
walks you through the potential solutions.
Exactly.
I agree. And I think the story of Joe and Lisa
Yeah.
really illustrates
Mm-hmm.
how bankruptcy can actually be a tool
Yeah.
for creating a more amicable,
Right.
fair resolution in divorce.
Absolutely. Imagine being in their shoes, arguing over who's going to take on what debt.
Right.
Feeling trapped and resentful,
Yeah.
filing for bankruptcy, especially jointly before the divorce,
Mm.
could be a way to just wipe the slate clean and move forward without that burden.
It's like they say in the book, sometimes it's better to just let go
Yeah,
of that debt
right.
and start fresh.
Absolutely.
It can really reduce conflict
It can.
and allow both parties to focus on building a better future.
Yeah, and it's important to remember
Yeah.
that bankruptcy isn't about avoiding responsibility. It's about finding a solution that works for everyone involved.
100%.
It's about taking control of your finances
Yep.
and creating a path forward.
And, one thing that really resonated with me from the book
Yeah,
was that knowledge is power.
that's right.
The more you understand about your options,
Mm.
the more confident you'll feel navigating these challenging situations.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That's why I think these resources like this book and these conversations,
So,
they're so valuable,
Mm.
and they help demystify these complex topics,
Yeah.
empower people to take charge of their own financial lives.
100%. So for anyone out there who's maybe going through a divorce or even just facing overwhelming debt,
Right.
remember that there are options available to you. Don't be afraid to reach out for help.
Absolutely. And remember, Juracy Law offers free consultations.
Oh, that's right.
That's a great first step.
Yeah,
If you're feeling lost or overwhelmed,
totally.
it's an opportunity to talk to an experienced professional
Yeah,
and explore all those possibilities.
great point.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
And hopefully we've given our listeners a better understanding of how bankruptcy can play a role in divorce.
I hope so. It's been a really insightful conversation. I
Yeah,
hope our listeners feel more informed and empowered to make the best choices for their own situation.
absolutely. And it's always remember that this was for informational purposes only, and it's crucial to seek personalized legal advice from a qualified professional.
Of course.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.